What happened during those 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Well, with the help of Ray Stedman's nice, neat, abundant research, I wanted to finish wrapping up this patiently waiting on God. It is called the 400 years of silence. But I want to ask you, was God really silent during that time? At the close of the book of Malachi, the nation of Israel is back again in the land of Palestine. We talked a lot about this, how they were in exile, and then they were finally coming back. Well, that's really where all the prophets come into play. And Nehemiah has now been the prophet who helped to restore and rebuild the temple. However, they were still under the Medo-Persian Empire. And as we said in Jerusalem, the temple had been restored. However, it was much smaller now than the one that Solomon had actually built. And within that temple was the line of the Aaronic priests, all the priests that go all the way back in lineage to Aaron from Moses. And they had been ordered to carry out the sacred rites, everything to the law of Moses. Now you may ask what happened in these 400 so-called silent years after the last inspired prophet spoke, before the New Testament writers began. I'll tell you exactly what happened. God was preparing for the birth of the Messiah. God was using that whole time, the 400 years, in exciting ways to prepare for the birth of his son. Now, why I'm going to tell you this information today is because it will help make the New Testament scriptures come alive. You are going to see things in a different light. You're going to make connections, maybe to things that had always left you puzzled and wondering. Well, we're going to look back at the end of the last prophet, and this is 435 years before the birth of Christ. At that time, there was a huge paradigmal shift. Up to that point, we had looked at all of the power had been over here in Babylon and Persia, everything in the east. For all these years, all these wars, that's where the power was. And it is at this point in time that we're going to see a big shift, because at the height of the Persian power, there arose a country from Macedonia, which was Greece. And a man by the name of Philip of Macedon united the islands of Greece, and it was his son who was destined to become the great world leader of all time, and that man was Alexander the Great. That's right. And this was about 330 BC. It was a huge battle between the Persians and the Greeks, and it entirely altered the whole course of history. Because in that battle, Alexander, believe this or not, was only 20 years old. And he led the Greeks to victory. And they demolished all of the power of Persia. And so the whole power of the world shifted from what had always been on the east. All of a sudden now, the power was in the west with the Greeks. Now, this is just a little trivia, but I thought, how sad, and it really shows the true human nature. Alexander died in 323 BC when he was only about 33 years old. This is a man who had conquered, in his eyes, the whole world of that region. His son had been murdered, and he drank himself to death because he was so depressed he had nothing left to conquer. Satan had given him everything. He'd given him power, he'd given him wealth, he'd given him countries. He was the leader of the world in his eyes, and yet he had no hope and nothing to live for. How sad. And because his son had been murdered, there was nobody to lead this entire empire to. And so it was divided up among 4 generals in his military. Now, if you've ever read the prophecies of Daniel, you will recall that Daniel was actually able to give an accurate and detailed account between the king of the North Syria and the king of the South Egypt. During this entire time, Daniel prophesies about it. Now, this is also huge, because when the Greeks take over, there's a new group that springs up. For how many thousands of years the Jews had stuck to Mosaic law. Everything strict into the law. But now they're influenced by a foreign nation, the Greeks. And the Greeks come in and they form the Hellenists. They were eager to bring in Grecian culture and thought into this nation. They wanted to liberalize it. And so this force split into two major parties. You had the conservatives who wanted to stay strong and tight to the Mosaic law, who became the Pharisees, and the Hellenistics who wanted to bring in Greek thought, who became the Sadducees. Does that sound familiar? That is who we deal with in the New Testament over and over again. Well, as we look to that, we see that there's also a third camp, because you had the priests who were in the temple. And there was one such young priest who rebelled against the Jewish laws. He went down to Samaria, married a Samaritan, and built a temple at Mount Gerizim, which became a rival temple to Jerusalem. We see throughout the entire New Testament that the Jews could not stand the Samaritans. I always thought it was because they were a mixed breed. It was Jews and Samaritans. That wasn't it. That was part of it. But the other part was that they had built a rival temple in Samaria. That did not go over too well. Well, also during this time, the Hebrew Scriptures were translated for the first time into Greek, into another language. And get this, it was by an Egyptian king. He got 70 men together, and he said, I want you to transcribe the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. Now, this opened it up for a lot more people to be able to read the Old Testament scrolls. Now, around 200 BC, we're getting closer, about halfway before the birth of Christ, there was a new king who came on the scene, and he was the vilest ever recorded in history. And he did the unthinkable. In fact, he's even called the Antichrist in the Old Testament, since he fulfills some of the predictions of Daniel. He persecuted the Jews, and his first act was to get rid of all the high priests in Jerusalem, thus ending the long line of succession from Aaron's lineage. Now think about this. We're talking thousands of years since Moses. Aaron's entire line had been the priest for Jerusalem. And this one man comes in and he stops it. And because of money and because of power, he sells it to another who starts a whole new priestly line. Now, in 171 BC, Antiochus invaded Egypt. And once again, Palestine was caught in the middle of this. I don't know if you realize this, but Palestine is the most fought-over country in the entire world. Think about that. Where's the Promised Land? It is the most fought-over country in the entire world. And Jerusalem is the most captured city in all of history. It has been pillaged, ravaged, burned, and destroyed more than 27 times. And yet, God has still been faithful to his chosen people. Well, rumor has spread through that this Antiochus has been killed in battle. So the Israelites are all excited and they're throwing a celebration and a party. Unfortunately, he's not dead. And he gets wind of it. And he comes back and he is so mad now. He overturns the city, he regains his power, and he kills 40,000 people in just 3 days of fighting. And this is the worst part. He forced his ways into the Holy of Holies. Remember, we just talked about Zechariah having that privilege of going into the Holy of Holies to burn the incense for the people. This was something that, if you were fortunate enough, your lot may have been cast once in your lifetime. And this man goes into that Holy of Holies. He destroys all the scrolls of the law. And in absolute horror to the Jews, he takes a pig and he sacrifices it on the temple altar. And And then he makes a broth from the flesh of this unclean animal, and he sprinkles everything in the temple, thus completely defiling and violating the sanctuary. Now, it's impossible for us to really grasp how horrifying that was for the Jews. But this act of defiling the temple was actually referred to by Jesus as the desolating sacrilege, which Daniel had predicted, and which also became the sign of the coming desolation of the temple, when the Antichrist himself will enter the temple again and call himself God, and thus defile the temple in the end times. See how the circle continues? Well, Daniel, the prophet, had said that the sanctuary would be defiled for 2,300 days. That's 2,300 days. And in exact accordance with the prophecy, it was exactly 2,300 days, which is 6.5 years before the temple was cleansed. And it was cleansed under the leadership of a man now famous in Jewish history as Judas Maccabeus. We just read from the mother of those 4 sons, Mrs. Maccabeus, her legacy that she left for her children. Now, Judas Maccabeus was one of the priestly line whose father and 4 brothers rose up as a revolt against the Syrian king. And in a series of battles in which they were always the overwhelming minority, they overthrew the power of the Syrian king and captured Jerusalem and cleansed the temple. Now, what you may not know was that series of battles lasted 40 years. I did some math. I started thinking about that. And if you added the Civil War, maybe even the Independence War, Vietnam, Korea, and World War I and II, you maybe come up with about 40 years. But look at the time span that is from beginning to end. And this was a 40-year chunk that they had to fight. Always the minority, and yet God was always with them and prevailed. Now, on the day, this is another neat little trivia fact, on the day that they cleansed the temple, it was named the Day of Dedication, and it occurred on December 25th. On that day, the Jews still celebrate the Feast of Dedication every year. Could that possibly be why Christmas is also on the day of December 25th? I don't know. Well, it was during this time that the Maccabees began a line of high priests for about the next 3 or 4 generations. However, as we've seen throughout all of history, there was one priest who had good earnest intentions, but instead of looking to God for provisions and protection against the Syrians, he looked to man. And he called up Rome, it's on the side of Greece, and asked for them for protection. Well, unfortunately, they got just the opposite. When the big war broke out, Rome came in. It was actually the Emperor Pompey. He came down from Damascus, and he entered into the city of Jerusalem, and he overthrew the city, and he captured it for Rome. And that was in 63 BC. And from that time on, Palestine was under the authority and the power of Rome. Who was in power when Jesus was born? Rome. When did it happen? 63 years before Jesus was born, because one priest went to Rome to man for protection instead of to God. 40 years they fought that battle to regain Jerusalem. And now we see that 63 years they're enslaved to yet another country, which is Rome. Now, Pompey, the Roman Senate, appointed Antipater as a procurator of Judea. And get this, he is a descendant of Esau. So, in turn, he had 2 sons, and he made them kings of Galilee and Judea. And the son that became the king of Judea is known to us as Herod the Great, who issued the decree to have all babies 2 years and under killed. So think about this. about Jacob, that we talked about in the Old Testament. And here we are, right up to the birth of Christ, and we have the descendant of Esau trying to annihilate the descendant of Jacob. Well, the other tidbit that I found that was so interesting is that not only is the temple still the center of the Jewish worship, but the building had been partially destroyed and rebuilt 6 different times since the close of the Old Testament. The 400 years of silence, the temple had been destroyed and rebuilt, get this, 6 times. But now, the temple has not become the main hub anymore with the priests. We said there's the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they were with the synagogues. And the synagogues are just popping up all over Jerusalem. And it's at this time that the people of Israel were split into 3 major parties. We had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And the Essenes are known mostly because they were the keeper and they hid the scrolls. And do you know what scrolls those were? The Dead Sea Scrolls, that's right. And in 1947, they were discovered by an Arabic shepherd. It was the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of the book, I think, of Isaiah, and several other scrolls that were still intact. I don't know if you realize, but that was only 2 years before Israel became a nation in 1949. My point is this. Was that all coincidence? Did those sit in that cave for all of those years just to haphazardly be discovered by a shepherd boy? No. God uses shepherd boys throughout the entire Scripture to help fulfill His plan, to set the stage. Well, we see that the Jews have gone through times of pressure and failed in their efforts to reestablish themselves, and they've given up all hope. And there was a growing air of expectancy that the only hope that they had left was the coming of the last promised one, the Messiah. And also in the East, after they had had all the power taken away from them, and the wisdom and the knowledge of the past had disintegrated, they too were longing for something. They were hopeless and looking for hope. So when the moment came that the star rose over Bethlehem, the wise men of the East, who were looking for an answer to their problems, saw it immediately and came out to seek the one who it pointed to. And as the Scriptures say, thus, when the time had fully come, God sent forth His Son. We see here in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, it opens with Zechariah, a priest, who his wife was the rightful heir to Aaron's lineage. However, just like all of the other patriarchs, they were barren. Have you ever noticed that? All of the important kids that come on the scene all came from parents who had to wait patiently to have children. Have you ever wondered why God has chose to make that happen so many times in Scripture? Well, this was Zechariah, and it was his turn to go into the temple, to the Holy of Holies, and the lot fell on him. This was huge. This was big. Only one time in his lifetime. And he had offered up prayers for a year that he and his wife would have a son or a child. And while he's there, God meets him, but in a miraculous way, through the angel Gabriel, and he tells him that he will have a son. But did he believe? It was too much to comprehend. Have you ever asked God for an answer to prayer? That when God finally answered you, you couldn't believe it? Because it just seemed too good to be true? Or it seemed earthly, impossible? Well, unfortunately, Zechariah gets a lesson learned the hard way. He told he will not be able to speak until John the Baptist is born. And he comes out unable to speak, and the people know that he has had a vision from God, and that something big is about to happen. As I look at this, and I look at nowadays, the the world has become just as hopeless of a place. Just as much now as it was then. And the one who would fulfill all of their hopes came into their midst. And so the world again is facing a time where despair is spreading wildly across the earth. Hopelessness is rampant and everywhere, and in this time God is moving to bring about the fulfillment of the prophetic words concerning his coming of his Son again into this world to establish his kingdom. How long, you may ask? How close are we? Who knows? But we are called to patiently wait. Just as those 400 years of silence, the Jews were called to patiently wait for the Messiah to come the first time, we are called to be ready and to patiently wait for his return. What God has done in history, I guarantee he will do again as we approach the end of the silence.